Hello, welcome back. If you watched Oppenheimer, you probably noticed that it's visually beautiful. There is a lot of things that they had to do to make it look visually beautiful as it is. But in this video, I'm going to show you one editing technique that makes a big part for why it looks so good. As you saw in the thumbnail, it is contrast. So in this video, I'm gonna use contrast to improve some of the pictures that I have taken in the past, and that same technique you can apply to your photos and videos to make it look way better. So let's start by clarifying what's contrast. In photography, contrast is the relationship between color, texture, brightness. In this occasion, we're going to focus on the relationship between the highlights and the shadows, pretty much the brightness. I'm going to use this picture to explain how contrast work with light. By the way, I'm going to be editing these pictures in Affinity since now Photoshop kind of sucks. But most photo editing apps should have these tools, these same tools. In here, these ones would be our brightest areas of the picture, which would be our highlights, and these dark areas would be our shadows, which are the darkest parts of the image. I'm gonna focus in this part, the highlights on the face, which are these areas that are the brightest part of the image. So what I'm gonna do is change the contrast. If I raise the contrast, you're gonna notice now that the change between the bright areas to the dark areas is very strong, is very sudden. So there is no much smooth switch between brightness and darkness. Is very sudden. But if I lower the contrast, now the dark areas look brighter, and the change between the bright area to the dark area is more smooth. Okay, so we're gonna use these along with a few other tools to make those 10 images look better. So we're gonna start with this image, which, if you notice, this one has very low contrast because the bright areas of the image, the highlights, have very little contrast to the shadows. Okay? So what we're gonna do to improve that is raise the contrast. Okay. Now these dark areas that they used to look very bright, now they are darker, creating better contrast with the bright areas. So this area that is very bright is our focus area. So we want to make it pop, to make your eye focus on that area. If it is flat like this, it's very hard to make your eye focus on the focus area. But like this, now it draws your attention to that area. Now we have contrast on the brightness, but we don't have as much contrast in the color. If you notice, this part where the sun touches, it has a warm color, but it's not warm enough. It looks kind of cold, just as the shadows, which look very blue. So to fix that, we're gonna go into the temperature. I wanna raise it. Now if you notice, the shadows don't look blue anymore, or not as blue, and the focus area, the bright area, now it looks warm, but not too warm. It looks warm enough to where it looks pleasant to the eye for you to focus on that area instead of the background or the foreground. So let's compare these two images now, how it looked before and after. And now you can see that by changing the contrast, the image looks way better. Okay, it makes the trees pop. You can still play around a little more with make some areas darker or brighter, or changing the temperature a little bit more, but I think this is good enough for now. Okay, so let's go to the next image. Now this image has a similar problem to where the whole image is very bright. Now this one is different to the previous one because in this one we have a clear sunbeam going through the image. Well, this one, since it was taken on a cloudy day, the light doesn't hit directly, but it bounces around, but instead it bounces through the clouds, which makes everything equally bright. But then the ground is full of snow, so the light bounces and hits the area where there should be shadows. But we still have areas that have shadows on it, dark areas, but it can be fixed with the same technique. We're going to raise the contrast, and now the dark areas look darker compared to the bright areas. Just like that, the image doesn't look as shallow. Okay, let's go to the next one. In this case, we're back into a bright image. However, since this one was taken in a very high shutter speed, it doesn't look as bright as it should. Now you could think, okay, well, we can raise the exposure, but if we do that, yes, this becomes brighter, but now we lose detail on the clouds. And if we raise the brightness, it's going to look brighter, but we're gonna lose some of the contrast that we have in the dark areas compared to the bright areas of the building. So what we're gonna do is that first we're gonna raise the shadows. This will at first make the image look very shallow, but when we add contrast to it, you'll notice that we retain all the detail while maintaining contrast. Now this image have too much contrast. If you notice, the shadows are very dark and the highlights are very, very bright. This picture was shot on a Sony a7 IV in RAW. So this means that it will retain a lot of information, even if at first glance it doesn't seem like it. So what we're going to do is very similar to what we do to the previous picture. We're going to make the shadows brighter, and voila, there you go. We have detail back from the shadows. Now you can still add more contrast if you like, and even though you add contrast, you will retain that detail from the shadows because we brighten the shadows. Okay, and there you go. That looks way better already. I may lower the contrast just a little. There you go. Now this picture was taken in RAW using the Sony a7 IV. RAW is great because it's able to keep a lot of information from the image, including in the very bright and very dark parts of the image. You can still do this with some smartphones. There are smartphones that shoot RAW. So if you have very harsh light, like in this situation where you only get very dark areas and very bright areas, I would suggest to shoot it in RAW. Now, if you shoot in JPEG, you might still be able to recover some information, but I wouldn't rely on JPEG to recover information from the shadows. So next picture. So this method also works on people, of course. We have here very bright areas and over here very dark areas. And if we lower the exposure to get more detail back from the bright areas, we lose detail on the shadows. And if we raise the exposure, we gain detail on the shadows, but we lose detail on the bright areas. We're gonna do the same thing again. We're gonna raise the shadows and now we get information back. But in this case, we lost contrast. There is not much contrast left on the hair or the face or the image in general. So after that, we simply raise the contrast. Not too much, just enough. And now we have dark areas while retaining detail and contrast. I might lower the saturation a little. Sometimes when you brighten the shadows, it might raise the saturation on the colors. So I'm gonna lower the saturation so it looks more natural. Okay. Now if we compare it to the previous image, you can see how we recover detail on the shadows while retaining detail in the highlights and keeping contrast. Okay, now in this one we have the opposite problem. The shadows look okay, but we seem to lost a lot of detail on the bright areas, and we have a very harsh light here in the face right here. We are actually now going to do the opposite. We're going to darken the highlights, and just by doing that small change, we have detail back to the snow, and the harsh light hitting the face, now it looks more natural. Now we can still improve this image. I feel like if we have too much contrast in this in the shadows, so we're gonna do the same thing. We're going to raise the brightness on the shadows, but now it looks a little bit shallow. So we raise contrast, not too much, and now we have detail in the highlights, detail in the shadows, and contrast in the image, which helps to make it pop out. Let's compare it to the previous image where we didn't have any information on the bright areas. You could see detail in the shadows, but it looked too dark and the contrast was very sudden. Well, now it looks more natural and it makes the image pop. Now this one, it has the same problem as the previous, but is more exaggerated, where the entire image is very bright. So we're going to do the same thing that we did in the previous image. We're going to darken the highlights, which will help us gain contrast to the shadows. Now we're going to add some contrast to it. Now you can appreciate more detail on the image. Okay, now in this one compared to this one, we could see some detail on the bright areas. This one looks like a big mass of white snow, but we can recover information from it. Previously we were raising the brightness of the shadows to recover the detail on the shadows. In this case, we want to recover detail on the highlights. So what we're going to do, instead of raising the highlights, we're going to darken the highlights, and in that way we can already see that we recover some detail. By reducing the exposure, we can reduce the brightness of the highlights, and now we can see even more detail. Now the problem that will come with this is that now the dark areas look too dark. What we can do about that is, just as we did before, raise the shadows, but now another problem came up. You can see now that the mids and shadows look flat. There's not much contrast, so we're going to raise the contrast. And now the image in general has more depth. From there you can raise or lower the brightness according to your taste. I think I'm going to leave it right there. And let's compare it to the original image, and we can see how we retain depth at the same time of recovering detail on the snow. Okay, of course this is a very exaggerated situation, so it's not gonna be perfect, but it looks better than the original image. Now here we have an even worse situation, or a better situation, depending on how you like it. If this picture by itself looks great, I think the idea is very well captured, to where everything looks white and snowy and the focus point is very obvious, giving us a very strong contrast with the highlights compared to the shadows. So this picture looks great. What I'm just gonna do with this image is just show you how, if you want to recover detail in the snow, how you can use the same method that we use on this previous image. So just as before, we're gonna lower the highlights, and we're also going to raise the shadows, because when we lower the exposure, it's gonna affect the shadows. And now by doing this, just as in the image before, we recover detail in the snow. We can make it a little bit more bright. Now in this one, we raise the shadows as well, but let me show you what would have happened if we wouldn't have raised them. The focus point would have become very dark in comparison, and it's not as pleasant. So that's why I raise the shadows, as I did with the previous image. And now let's compare, and we can see that we recover detail in the snow. Now in this last one, we have both problems. We have very strong highlights and very dark shadows. So to recover the data on both areas and still getting good contrast, we're gonna do two steps. First, we're going to, again, darken the highlights to recover detail on the highlights, and we're gonna brighten the shadows to do the same thing for the highlights. Now, again, this will make it look very flat, but then we add contrast. Now, just like that, this picture looks way better than before. Okay, we have detail in the highlights, we have detail in the shadows, and we have very good contrast, which even gives more depth to the clouds without making it too dark or too bright. Okay, I think I might actually raise a little bit the temperature. There you go. That would give temperature contrast between the cold color on the mountains compared to the light cast by the sunset. Okay, and just like that, and there you go. Just by tweaking the contrast, we can improve the look of an image, we can make it pop out and make it more pleasant to the eye. So that's it for today. If you like this video, give us a like and subscribe so you can see more videos like this in the future. And until then, have a good day.